All right. So are we recording already or?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, welcome everybody to the this week's seminar. We have Chris Garneau here. Really looking forward to this talk. First things first, this talk is put on by the graduate student community. This is our leadership team. So we've got Roshan and Rodney as our co-chairs. Our whole publicity team, Reza, Rajmohan, Taran, and me. Our support team, Nirvan, Emmanuel, and Megnath, and correspondents, Robert Rucker, and of course, Dr. Mystery. We have regular meetings that everybody's invited to join. They're usually on Fridays at 4 p.m. Right now, due to the current circumstances, they're being held over Zoom, but anyone can get on there if they want. And if you'd like to join us on Engage so that we can kind of, I guess, keep track of everything so you can get updates, we have this QR code. I'll just leave that up for everybody. If you want to scan that and join, feel free. All right. And then we, of course, also have a Facebook page, and that also has all of our events, any presentations and talks that are coming up. And it's a really good way to kind of keep track of what's going on. All right. And without further ado, today we're going to have Dr. Christopher Garneau on social predictors of political tolerance. I'm really looking forward to this one. It's going to be pretty neat. So I will go ahead and let him get started on that.
There we go. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share this really quick and maybe introduce myself a little bit as I do this. So let me get the share screen going. Okay, so this was a co-authored paper, and this was kind of like a series of research that I'd been doing with my co-author. So I'll say a little bit about him. His name's Philip Schwadel. He is a sociologist at the University of Nebraska there in Lincoln. And one thing I'll say about I know I'm speaking to a lot of graduate students here, is that, I've heard a lot of different stories about what it's like to work with professors in grad school. And I just want to say I had such a positive, overwhelmingly positive experience with my advisor. Someone who taught me a lot of things, but also, it's been 8 years since I got my PhD, and, we're still publishing together. We're working on our 5th right now. So, we've published 4, working on 5. And out of those 5, 4 have kind of followed in this same trajectory. And it's been really great working with someone who is sort of at the forefront of what they're doing. And also, it was intimidating at first, but really great because I've learned a lot and he comes to me for things. So for those of you that are grad students, just to let you know that those relationships are so important that you develop while you're in grad school. They become reciprocal and they can really help out later on down the line. So I do want to give a shout out to Phil. So what I'm going to be showing here is my interpretation of a lot of what we're doing, but this was a co-authored, I guess there was a lot of co-authorship going on. So the first publication we did, I was the first author. He did the next 3, he was the first author, and then I'm first author again here. So we've kind of taken turns, throwing the baton back and forth, but it's been a great working relationship. The other thing I want to talk about before we get into it, because it gets really statsy and nerdy very quickly, is just I like to do the broad views, so to be able to see the forest through the trees before we get into the statistics and modeling and all the other kinds of things. Why I care about this, and I really do care about like what we're talking about. And when I get into political tolerance, it will make sense a little bit more. But I feel that as Americans, we're at a place where we're beginning to find difficulties communicating with one another because of our politics and the way that we see the world differently. And so that's kind of the crux of what really inspired me to do this research. So it wasn't just that I found a cool data set and we had this new method that like worked, and because that is definitely true. We had the right kind of data and the right kind of formula. But at the heart of it, I just wanted to figure out like why do people get so hard-headed about things? How do why aren't we seeing things the same way? And I can look at something that seems so blatantly obvious, and someone who I know very well can see the completely different thing. I mean, like, how is that possible? How do we not see the same thing? So at least we're looking at one dimension of that conflict that we're currently dealing with at a societal level when we talk about political tolerance. So that's just my little I guess my little precursor to what we're going to talk about. And so the other thing we're going to do today is talk about these practical applications and how we can maybe use them in a more applied way. Okay, so let's talk about social change. Sociologists love to talk about why things change socially, obviously. So we're really interested in how views evolve over time. What are the major things that make these changes happen, that spur them on? Is it all these different factors that, are part of being human? So we're going to talk about three kinds of changes, and there are more kinds out there, but these are just the three that I'm dealing with. So the first one is an age change. And as you age, you do change. This is totally true. Something I probably didn't appreciate as much when I was 16 years old as opposed to now when I'm 42 years old. I see the world really differently. And so age changes things. We see that as people get older, they tend to change a little bit. So that's life course theory. The idea, when we measure religion, when you live with your parents, you go to church with them, and then in your early 20s, you tend to like kind of fall off the map a little bit. And then there's this really interesting thing where people all of a sudden start coming back to church, and when they get married and have children in their 30s and 40s, and we see that participation increase again. But same thing, political ideology, people get more conservative as they get older. Crime rates, there's almost no, I shouldn't say no, but a very, very small amount of violent crime that is not committed by men under the age of 25. So when we look at, just crime, people age out of crime, and criminologists are trying to figure out how do you keep young men between the age of 18 and 25 busy, right? It's like college jobs, those kinds of things. Because at around 25, 26, people just kind of stop committing crime, or at least serious crime. They stop doing drugs. A lot of people give up their addictions just magically at age 25, 26, once the amygdala connects to the prefrontal cortex and you're officially a full human being. So age does matter. There's also period changes. So age is as you get older. Period is changes that happen to everyone. So everyone in society, regardless of how old they are experiencing them together. So things that happen today in 2020, right? COVID-19, that is changing how everybody thinks about public health, I think. At least it should, right? So those are widespread, big things that have overarching implications. So views on health, that's a really good example. So like we all kind of learn together, smoking has negative consequences. COVID is generally bad. Somewhat in the South, somewhat changing views on race during the social rights movement. So we saw, people who had views of all different age groups all of a sudden starting to change as we saw the protests happening on television in the 1960s. And then the third kind of change we talk about is cohort change. And cohort is interesting. And it's, when I was younger, I'm a Gen Xer, barely. I'm almost a millennial, not quite, but I'm a Gen Xer. When I was younger as a Gen Xer, I never, there was no rift between the Gen Xers and the baby boomers and all this other kinds of stuff. And now I hear the term boomer being thrown around, and there's there's now Gen Z, the Zoomers, millennials. So, but cohorts do matter. It's generations. And a cohort is really, it's not necessarily a set number of years. It's just the things that happen to you during a specific time. So like my cohort happens to be, if you were born between 1965 and 1979, I was born in 78. So the idea is I'm a Gen Xer. I was raised in Reagan's America. Shopping malls, big corporations, Starbucks, like that was kind of, we tend to be like a conservative deviation from the generation before us, which were the baby boomers, and that was the, kind of the hippie generation, and which is different now, and then millennials and Zoomers. So it's basically this idea that as you grow up with these other people, you're going to experience the same things together. So a really good example is abortion. The baby boomers, as opposed to the previous generation, which is the silent generation, the baby boomers are much more liberal on abortion. And a lot of it had to do with the fight that happened during Roe v. Wade. That it was very real for especially the baby boomer aged women who were growing up during that time, who remembers life or have stories about life before Roe v. Wade. So My generation, Gen X, we're pretty much disconnected from that argument, right? So Gen X actually became more conservative on abortion than the baby boomers. We're also a little less tolerant in some ways than the baby boomers. The baby boomers are just uniquely, and I know they get a lot of flack, and I want to push back on that right now because I've heard this, people using the term boomer out there in a derogative way. For that age category, the boomers, adjusting for age, the boomers are the most tolerant generation that we've ever seen. I know that sounds really crazy to hear that, but that is 100% true. And we have data to back that up. So they're actually very tolerant, very liberal. And yes, there are conservative people in every generation. And, the most extremely liberal or conservative tend to have the loudest voices. So we, latch onto those. But the boomers are really interesting in that they are, for their age, generally really open-minded. Military conflicts is another really great example. So the boomers tend to be American boomers are pretty pacifistic. If you look at their views on war military, because they remember the Vietnam War, they know people who died, and so that's very visceral to them. It matters. My generation, we had wars in the Middle East, but we were really disconnected from it in a lot of ways. We didn't have a draft, there wasn't conscription, there wasn't all this other kinds of stuff that was going on, and there weren't protests that were happening. That's the other big thing. So, anyways, larger point. Change happens in three ways. You get older, that's one way. Number two, it happens to everyone because things happen in society. Or number three, it only happens to people in your generation. And the reason why the cohort changes matter, and I know this is kind of a macabre way of saying it, it's because older generations pass away and the older ideas that they have then will basically roll over to the new generations who are born. So when changes happen, it's like cohort replacement, if you want to think about that. So the views of the older generation get replaced by the views of the younger generations, who will then become the older generations to be replaced and over and over and over. So it's kind of a rollover effect. So those are the three ways that we're going to talk about social change. Okay, well, that's all good and well. So we can do that. We can create regression models where we have age as an independent variable. That's super easy to do. We can measure age in a linear form, or we can use a quadratic transformation and measure it as a nonlinear form, all kinds of things we can do. We can do the same thing with periods and cohorts, but we do have a very specific problem. And that is that when you actually try to put all three of these variables in together into a model, we end up with errors between shared random errors between periods and cohorts. And the reason is because they're overlapping. So age, we can disentangle a little bit, but the problem is, how do you tell if something is really a period effect and something is really a cohort effect? In other words, is it due to just the time that you're living in? Is that why you think the way you do? Or is it because the generation that you're a part of tends to be a certain way? And let me back up a little bit. So we're going to use what's called hierarchical linear modeling, which is just a fancy way of saying multi-level, discernment. And we do this with schools all the time. So if we're trying to figure out what makes kids succeed in school, and sociologists have been looking into this forever, education researchers have been looking into this forever. They're like, well, it's this thing about the kid, or it's this thing about the kid, or it's this thing about the kid. Well, is it the kid or is it the school? Because the issue that you have when you try to model that is you're assuming that all children are acting certain ways based off of their individual characteristics, regardless of their social context. So what you're doing is you're providing context, because what you can do is, in a hierarchical linear model, you have the individual attributes of the students down here. And then on top of that, you stack on the school attributes, because schools are different, right? And then on top of that, it's the neighborhoods, or you can get inside and say the families. And so the point is, with hierarchical linear modeling, it's nesting. So you're taking individual data within a social context, within a social context, within a social context. I'm really excited that we are talking to people outside of the social sciences today, because I am, I work at a university that's very interdisciplinary. It would be really interesting to see if you could nest, for example, individual differences within a social context, within a natural context. You know what I mean? Like within certain types of natural environments or something. I don't know. And that's where I need to talk to someone else. But anyways, you can do that. It's a method that allows for that. So what we do here is we deal with this basic issue, which is that period, if you try to measure it, is actually just age plus cohort. Or in other words, the year that you take the survey is just your age plus the year that you were born. So you have too much collinearity going on within the model, or in other words, shared variance. And that's the same reason why you can't, if we were to measure schools, you can't put in individual information about the children along with the school information, along with neighborhood information, because those children have individual differences, but they also have shared variances and differences within the schools and within the neighborhoods. And it all kind of gets, it gets messy and it gets noisy. And so what hierarchical linear modeling does is it allows you to disentangle that. So what we're doing is using that same basic nesting method, but instead of thinking it in terms of geography, nesting people within geographic units, we're doing it with time. So it's a time construct. So here's how we do it. We have different levels. In hierarchical linear modeling, you can have 3, 4, 5 levels. We tend to work within about 2, maybe 3 levels. In this particular study, we're only using 2. So age is modeled at level 1. That's considered to be an individual level kind of data. So age is level 1. Period and cohort are modeled as cross-classified units at the level 2. So at level 2, that's where we bring in period and cohort, because we can talk about differences in the variance between period and differences in the variance between cohorts. So this way we can adjust for that shared random error of individuals within the periods and the cohorts. So periods have their own variance and cohorts have their own variance. That way we can tell if a change in attitude is a period change happening to everyone at the same time, or a cohort change happening to specific generations as they get older. Okay. So, and then the random intercepts produce period and cohort residuals that are then interpreted as effects. So this is, if you can see it on your screen, I'm not going to disentangle this for you, but I just want to show you the mathematics that are involved. This is something that we came up with in our first paper in 2014, and I was just getting into my first tenure track job when Phil and I were kind of hammering this out. I'm not going to go through it, but you have the slides there if you would like to take a look at it. It allows for you to model it for yourself. If this is something anyone's interested in trying out, there is a program called HLM. Hierarchical linear modeling costs about $150. You just buy it on your own. Or if you use Stata, you can actually program Stata. And I'm giving you the basic breakdown of formula here that can be applied. So you have to have the right kind of data in order to do it. But this is the nuts and bolts of how to do it. Okay, so here is what we are measuring. We are measuring political tolerance, and you can use this for everything. So APC models have been used, age period cohort models have been used for measuring happiness, measuring changes in religiosity, all these kinds of things. But we're looking at political tolerance. So Samuel Stouffer was kind of the big shot that wrote on political tolerance first. He was mostly interested in changes in views of communism, which is one thing that we are looking at, but we're extending that. But political tolerance is the extent to which citizens agree that political and social rights should be extended to stigmatized groups. So the overall idea that groups that you don't like should still have civil rights. So you may or may not like these X group of Americans, but you think that they should be able to, and we have 3 different questions that we ask, teach in a college, they should be able to give a speech in public, or they should be able to have the books that they publish available in a public library. And so these are the groups that we have data on. And this is from the General Social Survey. And General Social Survey has data dating back to 1972 through 2018. So we have nearly 50 years of cross-sectional data. So we're looking at, do you agree that these groups should be able to do these things? Gays and lesbians, anti-religionists, which are atheists, communists, militarists, which, by the way, they were really late 70s, early 80s. Militarists, that was a kind of a buzzword. It really went away up until very recently. We're talking about militias. So people who are like very anti-government militias, racists, and then only recently, as of 2008, I believe they started asking questions of Muslims as well. Okay, so looking at groups that might be stigmatized, and what's interesting about the GSS is they use groups that maybe can be, for some reason, seen as more stigmatized by liberals and those who might be more stigmatized by conservatives. So that allows us to look at differences between these different groups. So I can tell you right now that racists traditionally have the lowest level of tolerance from both liberals and conservatives. And the group that's really increased, and we'll get to that in a little bit, is gays and lesbians. So different levels for different groups. So the first publication, I'm gonna blow through these really quick, the first paper is just figuring out, is there a difference in political tolerance over time? So that was examining the APC changes here. And that was our social quarterly paper. So the question was, how has political tolerance towards social outgroups changed over time? Well, basically we found that political tolerance for all groups increased across periods. So all groups became more favorable to Americans, and that's great. We're becoming more tolerant as a nation. Especially gays and lesbians and communists. Gays and lesbians, we think because a lot of family members or a lot of families have people who are in the LGBTQIA plus community, and that changes a lot of minds when it becomes more prevalent across society. And communists, because communists stopped being a buzzword. In fact, it was weird. This is like in the last year, I've heard the words socialist and communist thrown out around. That is new. Like in at least the years I've been observing politics, that's not something that has really come across. So that's really just kind of resurfaced. Political tolerance for anti-religionists increased across cohorts. And this is an interesting effect in that it depends on the cohort that you're in. Millennials are especially okay with atheists. So that like newer cohorts seem to be okay with them. You know, I did my dissertation on the stigmatization of atheists. That's what I did. And at that time, when I wrote it in 2012, atheists were the least trusted group in America. That has changed in the last 8 years, but they had severe social distrust. Why has that changed? Because millennials don't really care. They got older, and the Zoomers don't seem to particularly care either. Baby boomers are unique in their high levels of tolerance. So it didn't matter what group we were looking at. Baby boomers were just very, very tolerant overall. And we also found that education has a positive effect on tolerance, and that kind of makes sense. And that led us to our next paper, which is how examining these changes across social class tend to matter. So here we're looking at, does social class, income, and education specifically affect political tolerance over time? Okay, so what we found is that political tolerance is positively associated with both income and education levels. Big difference though, education seems to have far more impact on people becoming more tolerant than income. So, and we can disentangle these two, by the way. So income on its own, and for reasons that are kind of hard to explain. Like income allows you to move to different areas a little more. It gives you more access to other kinds of people so that you can kind of, meet, the more people you meet, the more tolerant you tend to be, but it's really education. That's the driving force. I mean, think about it. You go to college, you get a chance to meet people who I've never met an atheist before, or never met someone who of a different religion before, some of a different racial group before. And so education is just kind of this, if you want to think about it, it's rocket fuel for tolerance. And that is one of the most robust findings that we found. So political tolerance associated with both, but period and especially cohort effects demonstrate the narrowing gaps in political tolerance between Americans of high versus low SES. So what we found here is that there's actually a lessening of the gap, that as Americans become more tolerant as a whole, the differences in income and education actually matter less. And some of that has to do with the fact that more people are going to college. But what that means, we use the term cultural laggards, and that sounds horrible, but there was a paper that came out on environmental practices like recycling. And so it showed that like in the 1960s and 1970s, it was the upper class or the cultural innovators. And by upper class, I mean educated, high income. So the innovators are the ones that recycled first, and then eventually it diffuses. So cultural diffusion happens, and it diffuses down to the lower classes. And then eventually the lower classes pick up on recycling. So that's kind of how these trends happen. But same thing happens with diet. So what was it? It was at one point in time, iceberg lettuce was seen to be very fancy, and it was like the upper class that ate iceberg lettuce. And then over time, it diffused down to the lower class. And once the lower class is doing it, sometimes the upper class doesn't want to do it anymore because it's like everybody's doing it. And it's not, there's kind of an elitist thing to it. But recycling is a really good example of something that diffused down to a lot of different social classes. Well, it turns out tolerance is the same way. So the upper class starts being more tolerant. And then eventually it starts diffusing down through the middle, the working class, and the poor. Or you can think about it in terms of education. Now, there's still differences in tolerance based off of education and income levels, but they have decreased over time. The gap has decreased. So the largest declines in period-based declines were found for views of gays and lesbians. What that means is that across time, the gap for both education and income for gays and lesbians has really decreased to where there's so little difference now. And we can talk about why later, that one group especially. Declines in views of racists were modest because people don't like racists in general, but declines in cohort differences on views of communists and atheists were significant. And these findings suggest that political tolerance can diffuse, that our idea of diffusion does actually work. And so we had kind of a theoretical proposition in there that said that if it starts with the upper class, eventually it's going to get down to everybody else. Okay, so let's talk about this paper. So this is the paper that was published in Social Religion in 2018, and because it was, I don't remember what the issue was, but it got thrown in with the 2019 papers because I think it was published in the latest volume, but I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, this is the one that we won the award for. So a lot of journals have this, but the Sociology of Religion, they go through their different submissions for that year, and this one was considered to be the most methodologically unique and whatever. So anyways, it's pretty cool. I got a research award. So I got to, we were supposed to go to Pittsburgh this summer, which didn't work. So we had a Zoom meeting instead, but I got a cool little plaque. And so very, very happy and proud of this. I mean, we did a lot of work for this one in particular. But what we're looking at specifically, or the question that we're dealing with, it says forthcoming, it's out there now. The question that we're dealing with is, does religious sectarianism, and sectarianism is like your religious affiliation, like how conservative or traditional you are religiously. And so we're looking at evangelical Protestants as sectarians, but we're also looking at sectarian practices like biblical beliefs, how fundamentalist you are in your religious belief. Does that predict tolerance? Because our hypothesis is evangelical Protestants who are sectarians, meaning separate, are probably going to be less tolerant than the rest of society as a whole. But also, it's not just evangelicals. We also want to know, is it the things that evangelicals tend to do? So, we can look at things like church attendance. Does going to church more make you less tolerant? Or does having a strict view of the Bible, does that make you less tolerant? So those are the things that we're looking at. So the data is a general social survey. We're actually starting in 1984 instead of 1972 this time, because that is when we have our religious affiliation data available, when we know what denominations people belong to. And we use an entire big coding scheme you can ask me about to decide if someone is an evangelical, a mainline Protestant, a Catholic, Jewish, other religion. So there's a big coding scheme that we use. So our dependent variables here, we're looking at the same things we were in other papers. So overall political tolerance, how tolerant are you in general across all these measures, but then subscales of the different groups. So gays and lesbians, communists, anti-religionists, racists, militarists, and Muslims. Our independent variables are your religious affiliation, if you're evangelical or something else, other affiliation and no affiliation. And then literal word of the Bible. So for those of you that don't do religious stuff, biblical literalism means you believe every word of the Bible is true, which for a lot of people means the earth is 6,000 years old. A burning bush talked, a snake talked in the garden. It all happened. There's no story there. And that versus the inspired word of God, which is like not every word is true, but it's all informed by God, or it's just a book of fables, a book of stories. There's nothing true in there. It's just stories that were told. So that's the other thing we're looking at. And then we're controlling for age, education, family, income, basic stuff that we tend to do in the social sciences. Okay, so the method, again, we're using HAPC models. I'm not going to go through that again. explained that earlier, but that's essentially what we're doing, looking at differences between age period and cohort. And we're using ordinal logistic regression, which is at the independent level, we're not looking at for every 1 unit increase in the IV, there's a change in the DV. We're saying compared to a reference category, our non-reference categories score either higher or lower. So we're using midpoints as reference categories within the IV. So for example, if we look at the literal word of God, what we're doing for the independent variables, we're using the inspired word of God, since that's kind of the midpoint, as the reference category. And then the variables that we actually bring into the model are biblical literalism and Book of Fables. So literalism and fables get the 1, inspired word of God gets the 0, and that allows us to model that in the equation. Okay, so I'm not going to get super in depth into this because honestly, I'm not interested in statistics. I'm a statistician. I'm a quantitative researcher. I just like telling the story. So let's not focus on the numbers as much as telling the story. So in model 1, first, we're just looking at this is level 1, these fixed effects. So in general, yes, we find that evangelicals, we've got a negative coefficient here, and the stars mean it's significant. So evangelical Protestants are less tolerant of outgroups in general, and the unaffiliated, meaning no religion, tend to be more tolerant compared to all other religious groups, right? So when we single those two out, we definitely see that those are important effects. Similarly, we find that in general, people who are biblical literalists are less tolerant versus those who think the Bible is just a story. And those people tend to think that they are more tolerant. The outgroups should have far more rights. So we do see something with sectarianism at the base level. So that's where we're starting. And by the way, these are all of these numbers are controlled for all of our demographics. So we've got a whole slate of controls that are happening in the background that you can't see here. Now, when we model them together, we notice that the effect of evangelical affiliation is basically cut in half. So being an evangelical matters, but when you include biblical literalism in the model, it's not necessarily that they were evangelical. I mean, yes, it's still significant, but a lot of it has to do with the things that encompass being an evangelical. And we see not much change here for biblical literalism. So biblical literalism is driving a lot of the intolerance, more so than just calling yourself an evangelical, which again does matter, but not nearly as much as the things that evangelicals tend to do. Okay, so now we're going to add in our period and cohort effects for evangelical Protestants. And what we find is that there is an increase, so it's a positive coefficient. There is an increase over time for evangelicals. Evangelicals have become more tolerant of other groups at a significant level. And actually, their increase is a little bit more noticeable than those who are unaffiliated, which shows that shrinking, right? And in terms of cohorts, and those are more period effects. Cohorts, evangelicals have become more significant by cohort level, but not for the unaffiliated. Okay, and this is just a visual to kind of show what we're looking at. Let's focus on this one over here. These are showing the period effects of evangelicals and non-affiliated. So unaffiliated is the broken line, evangelicals are the solid line. You can see over time that evangelicals have really caught up. So look at the gap in 1984 between unaffiliated and evangelical in terms of their tolerance. And then look in 2016 and you see that gap has shrunk dramatically. Okay, and then if we look at biblical literalism, we can see that biblical literalists, there are significant period effects over time. They become more tolerant, but also across cohorts, we find biblical literalists and non-literalists to have both increased in terms of their level of political tolerance. And again, let's focus on this particular graph. You can see that in birth cohorts, that the differences in political tolerance have shrunk quite a bit. Okay, and so real quick, I just want to run through, these are the individual groups. So looking at differences in tolerance for our ordinal logistic regressions. Just to see if there are any major differences, because the tolerance scale that we were looking at before is an incorporation of approval for all of these groups taken together as a scale. And this is looking at each of the groups individually. So we can see that there's really no connection between evangelical Protestantism and tolerance towards Muslims, but for unaffiliated, those who are religiously unaffiliated, they are significantly more tolerant towards Muslims. Those who are biblical literalists, and here's where we see this is a huge effect. Biblical literalists tend to have very strong feelings of not extending tolerance towards Muslims, and almost the complete opposite inverse for those who see the Bible as a book of stories. Towards atheists, again, evangelical affiliation doesn't matter, but of course the unaffiliated, that's kind of their group, they feel pretty positively towards giving civil liberties to atheists. And again, here, not as strong as Muslims, but pretty close. If you look at seeing the Bible as the literal word of God, very negative correlation with tolerance. With gays and lesbians, and this is an interesting story, affiliation doesn't matter. And this is something we've seen over time, is that there's been such an increase in support for gays and lesbians that it doesn't extend by affiliation. But then if you look at this is just such a huge difference, such a large coefficient. So those who are biblical literalists, which, by the way, only encapsulate about 20% of Americans, but for those 20% of Americans, large disapproval. Racists, we only see one effect, and that is some people, and we can talk about why this is, but people who are biblical literalists are less tolerant of racists than anyone else. And all the, evangelicals and unaffiliated, no real difference here. And, if you have any questions afterwards, I can talk to you about racists specifically, because there's a lot of confusion about which groups should be more or less tolerant towards racists. Turns out people with higher levels of education are more tolerant of racists. People who, as some liberals would think, have racist views, who are maybe less educated, are actually less tolerant of racists. So it's an interesting effect. And then within communists, again, pretty strong effect here for biblical literalism, which, why does that matter for communism? Has connotations of what was happening during the Cold War. So those things are still kind of reminiscent. So these are the differences that we see by group, and we thought it was important to be able to tease those out. Okay, so conclusions. We know that the effect of sectarian religion on political tolerance declines in general. So while, yeah, it does matter, if you're an evangelical or a biblical literalist, but over time it tends to decrease. Those differences tend to decrease. Also, the effect of affiliation with evangelical Protestant denominations fully goes away. So period effects for evangelicals generally does not matter all that much, but the effect of biblical literalism declines and remains mostly robust. So it really is about what you believe, not who you're affiliated with. The patterns hold across the subscales of tolerance. So we see that while there are differences in the subscales, that we can see some discernible patterns, and they're the same kind of patterns that we see in the actual APC models. And while biblical literalism remains relevant, religious affiliation no longer strongly associates with political tolerance. Okay, so just that affiliation, again, didn't matter nearly as much when we throw them together. So to sum it all up, if we look at this particular research methodology, it's a fairly robust method on how we can figure out how things happen over time. And here I'm saying social change, but maybe I'm putting some seeds of ideas for other folks on how you could model things that happen over time as well. What's really nice about it is you can use linear or dichotomous outcomes. So your dependent variables don't have to be any particular level of measurement. And it can be modeled with a variety of stats programs. HLM, as I mentioned before, you can model it with Stata. It'll crash it the first time you do it. SPSS is starting to be able to take on some of those kinds of things, but Stata is what's kind of popular right now. And it's especially useful for cross-sectional survey data spanning several decades. So this is, you need to have data that's, gives you at least a couple decades to work with. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to see those differences. There's not going to be major differences. And then, so for example, I'm showing the general social survey, but also the national election survey. That's another great survey that can be used for this model or this method. So what is the story? Why is it important? Why do we care about it? So first off, it's a great way to talk about social change because it contextualizes it in ways that we haven't been able to talk about it before. So it's just, it's still kind of new and exciting. Our first publication was 6 years ago. So, we've been cited a lot. Other people are starting to use this model and this method, which we think is just really great that it's taking off the way it is. And APC models explain how a society changes, which that's the other thing I really like. So, in sociology, a lot of times we spend all this time just showing that there is a change, and then we hypothesize as to, or theorize as to why this happened. Well, here we can actually get some context. We can't answer everything, but we can, when we're trying to explain that variance, we're closing that gap of unexplained variance as much as we can. So good theory and follow-up research are important for explaining why a society changes. And just happy that we got a chance to be able to add to that conversation. And here's what I'll end with today. We talk about how divided we are in terms of how we think about each other and other groups. If there's anything I can leave you with, and we don't have the 2020 data yet, we got 2018 data. Tolerance went down a little bit between 2016 and 2018. And that was not part of this publication. We didn't have the 2018 data yet. In 2000, I've looked at it myself. In 2018, the data did go down a little bit, or the level of tolerance, not a lot. But here's what's fascinating to me. So I just wanted to look at, not to overly politicize this, but I just wanted to look at differences in politics, because I hang out in a bubble of people who are pretty left wing, but as college professors sometimes tend to be. And so I think there's this general assumption that conservatives and all these Trump voters were really intolerant, and the liberals were really tolerant, whatever. So I just want to let you know how this turns out by voting, because that's our next paper, by the way. The one we're working on right now is political affiliation and political ideology and voting patterns. Trump voters did have the least amount of tolerance in general, but it wasn't much different than Clinton voters. The most tolerant voters in 2016 were actually the independents and the ones who decided not to vote. They had phenomenally high levels of tolerance. So there's something, and this is what we're trying to figure out. We don't have it. Don't have it locked down yet. Something about aligning yourself with a camp that tends to reduce your level of understanding and empathy of others. And there's probably some good psych research out there that we can look to for that, but we don't know how to get it into our model yet. So that's what we're working on. But I am hopeful, and this is why. If you look at the long-term trajectory, if you talk about the arc of history bends towards justice, we are becoming more tolerant. It is a robust and continuous finding. We are caring about each other more. We have a society that is less violent than it's ever been. And I know these last few years have been really weird, but crime has been going down steadily. We are starting to edge away at global poverty in certain types of ways. We are fighting a really difficult battle against climate change, but we're starting to make strides. So when I look at my models, when I look at this data, the reason I get so excited about this work is that it makes me optimistic, despite all of some of the indicators that are frustrating and the things that hold us back from progress. I'm still really excited about the fact that human beings, at least in the United States, while there are differences, that in general, we're all kind of we're moving along, and some people have to kind of be pulled along, but eventually, just like we had to pull people along to recycle, hopefully we can get people to start thinking about others as equals and thinking about them with levels of compassion. So that's a lot of talking for me. I would love to hear any thoughts, ideas, questions, discussion that you have. I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint and open it up to the floor.
All right. Does anyone have any particular questions they'd like to ask right away? If nobody has one immediately, I kind of have one that you may or may not know. I was kind of curious about the tolerance over time. You had one slide that had I think about 100 years or so. I'm not totally sure. And there was it looked like a sharp dip in the 1940s. Was that right?
Oh, tolerance in the 40s would have been, actually, let me pull that up real quick. That would have been not quite as far back as we had data. The dip in tolerance that I think you were looking at is actually more recent than that. So overall, we went through there we go. There was a sharp, in the 1980s, we went through a sharp decline in tolerance. And actually in 2004, tolerance had this sharp, jagged decline. We think it had to do with the religion and politics of that time. So I was a kid in the 80s. That was, capitalism was all the rage as we were kind of like closing the door on the Cold War. Those were the Reagan years, and it was very patriotic. And so we know that patriotism decreases tolerance towards others. Love of your own, like the more, it's kind of weird. The more you love your own country, the more you are likely to fear those who might threaten it. And so the 80s were a weird time. And that was a period effect. So that means that was happening to everybody, the boomers, the Xers, everybody was experiencing that at the same time. So yeah, those are the two kind of, and who's in charge does kind of matter. The Obama years are really interesting. They're just so high levels of tolerance, just in general. Just everything was just very, social trust was really high, those kinds of things. We don't yet know exactly what happened in 2016 because the last data that we have is 2018. So what happens when you have differences between these different, and I don't want to boil it down to just the presidency, but these different administrations, like in general, we do know that they matter. They actually have an impact on the social tenor of everyone. So to kind of answer your question, yeah, there was this dip in the 80s. There was this dip kind of in the middle of the Bush years a little bit. And then during other kinds of presidencies, we see increases. But it's not just a Democrat-Republican phenomenon, because during the Bill Clinton years, we didn't see a drastic increase. Towards gays and lesbians, we did. But towards the other groups, we didn't see drastic increases the same way we did with the Obama years.
Hi, Dr. Garneau. I had a question. Probably it's just a question that I had in my mind. As we are talking about like intolerance and how it stems from a certain way we think, right? But why do you what do you think is the most contributing factor towards us thinking based on our ideology and not based on proper humanitarian view? Like, let's say I might have a difference with someone, but I do not talk down to them, or I do not I make sure that it's a civil discussion. And at the end of the day, we are humans and we want to treat each other the way that we want to. But what trumps the idea of the thought that comes from an ideology and not from a humanitarian side?
That's a great question. So that's a question for social psychologists, and luckily I do teach a little social psych. So the way that we really should treat each other, honestly, if you want to think about, if we have to discern between each other, what was the Martin Luther King Jr. said, judging by the content of character, right? We would have to go around and meet everyone and get to know them, know their story, see how they treat us. And that just takes a lot of time. And so humans if you think about evolution, the things that we don't need, we lose, right? If you don't need great eyesight, you're going to lose, over time, that organism is going to not need to see all that much. Why don't we have body, as much hair as other primates? It's the same thing psychologically in terms of brain development and brain evolution. We need to pare things down and do things quickly. And so we need to make discernments. And we, for example, I drive the Chickasha from Norman every day. I live in Norman and work in Chickasha. So when it's not a pandemic, I drive through Blanchard every day. And most days, I don't even remember going through Blanchard. I know I did. I had to get to Chickasha to Norman, but I don't remember it. Why? Because it becomes unimportant. So my brain just naturally filters out the things that are unimportant. And that's what we call cognitive misering. So to conserve energy, we tend to group things together. We categorize things together. We blank things out. So our memories are, first off, horrible. Like, your memory is completely untrustworthy, and so is mine. We have horrible memories because it's skewed by our biases constantly. But the other thing of it is we use these little shortcuts. So from an evolutionary perspective, when you had tribal groups that could have been warring against each other during our hunting and gathering days, you had to figure out who you're going to trust, right? Who are you going to tolerate? Who are you going to trust? And you have just a basic amount of information to be able to make that decision. Do I trust you or do I not trust you? And one of the things that we use as proxies to reduce the amount of information that we need to take in and to make those decisions much more quickly is group affiliation. You are a blank, therefore I should trust you or I should not trust you. So in general, Americans, if you are a American, yeah, I'll trust you. You are a soldier, yes, I will trust you. But you throw in these other names, you are a racist, no, I won't trust you. Or you are a communist, no, I won't trust you. So while those labels kind of dehumanize us, it's a very human, using this executive decision to trust or not based off of group affiliation is unfortunately just a very human way of doing things. And it's fast. How do you break that down? It takes conscious effort. Like you actually have, like people who have gone through transformations where they have grown up, people who were white supremacists, who grew up in very racist contexts can lose that. They can learn to become much more open people and to not have those racist feelings. But it takes a very active, open approach to be able to doing it, to override that natural evolutionary function we have, which is to very quickly discern between people based off of group affiliation. So the long answer to your very short, succinct question that I enjoyed very much is that we have these very complex brains that need to make these decisions very quickly. And sometimes that means that we don't get to know people at a human level before doing those, which is where a lot of discrimination and bigotry comes in.
Oh, no, absolutely. I love your answer because in a way, that's where my question was coming from in terms of like, if I had to put it even shortly, it was like, why the labels and how we label people. And let's say in this current political discussion, we tend not to engage in discussion if we think they are affiliated with that part of which they don't trust. So I completely understand and I really like the answer. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Yeah, Christopher, I have a question for you. You have come up with these. You have these surveys, and you've got the information from the surveys. How do you extract the information from the surveys? Do you use some computer system, automated system? Do you go through it by hand? How do you do it?
Yeah. So the survey itself is fascinating. It's the General Social Survey, which comes from the University of Chicago. And they get a national grant. And I actually know how this works because my friend Rick works on this survey, or he did when he was a grad student at Chicago. So every 2 years, they get a government grant to survey about 2,500 Americans. So we have a data set of about 60,000. That's our sample size, about 60,000 people. And that's huge. That's a really big data set. So here's how they get that data. At least that's how they get it today. So Rick goes out in his car and he's got a tablet from the University of Chicago, and it gives him a GPS coordinate of someone in Oklahoma, and he has to drive there. And sometimes it takes him out to Godibo. Sometimes it takes him to the middle of Oklahoma City. And it says, go to the door, knock on it, and ask to survey the second person in the household. And so you knock on the door, the first person comes in and says, excuse me, can you list out the number of people in this home randomly? And so they do that. And then if it's the second person, if that's what the computer said, then you interview the second person as long as they're over the age of 18. And then, you get the information from them, and then they give you another GPS coordinate and you go there. And so they have a system set up so that it is a random, we're getting a random sample of people in the United States. There are problems with that. And the number one problem is that not everybody trusts someone who shows up in a car with a clipboard or now it's like an iPad. So we tend to, groups that would be more afraid of that. So for example, we undersample minority groups in general, but we really undersample Latinx Americans. And a lot of that has to do with anti-immigration kinds of sentiments and, that kind of fear that generates. Also, we don't know anything about the ultra wealthy. And this is a story that Rick told me himself. He said when they do the training for the GSS, for the survey, they say sometimes you're going to get a coordinate for a very wealthy neighborhood that is gate protected. So what you do is you wait until one of the residents in that gated community comes home and enters the code, and then you sneak in behind them when the gate opens and go in as if you belong there, because you do. You're doing a service to your country by getting information. But wealthy people don't want to talk. They're the least likely to want to talk. And by wealthy, I mean multimillionaire or higher. We have no data on them at all, like none. We have no idea what their lives are like. They don't want to talk. And the way that we get people to talk is we start offering cash incentives up to like $100 after our first failed attempt, second failed attempt. That's not enough to sway them. Their time is generally more important than that. So we have almost no data whatsoever on wealthy people. So if you want to know like who we're underrepresenting, it is minority groups, but it's also very powerful people. We just don't know anything about them. So that's where the information comes from. And the GSS, it's public data that's available to anyone. So anyone here could actually download it today. You can get it on SPSS, Excel, or Stata. And so the data can just be downloaded, and because it's a federal grant, it's open to everyone. But if you don't really have a reason to use the data set, you generally don't get it. But what's really cool is you can go to the website for the data set and do like variable searches. Or 6,000 questions that are asked, not every year, but that have been asked. And so there's questions about the environment, there's questions about crime, there's questions about every, type of social thing you can think of. And even some, one of the ones I like to use is science knowledge. Like there's a little science test that they have, and they have the scores for the science test on there. You can see how people did. So it's just a very big, robust kind of survey that's used every year. And so, in terms of how do we get the survey data, luckily we don't have to do anything on our end because it's really expensive. You can pay to get a question put on it, but it's very expensive. So we just, we just use secondary, what we call secondary data that's already out there. The advantage is it's representative. It's been weighted. So, for these groups that are underrepresented, we can weight it so that we can get a more, it's actually more accurate than the census. The downside is, because it's survey data, people lie a lot. So for example, when you ask people how much they go to church, 40% of Americans say they go to church, every week. It's actually only 20%. If you ask what percentage of Americans voted in the 2016 election, it's like 71%. We know that's a lie. If you ask people who they voted for, we know a majority voted for Clinton in 2016, but according to the General Social Survey, a majority voted for Trump. Why? People like to pick winners in hindsight. So again, you're asking people questions using their biases, and that's where we get a lot of statistical noise that comes into social science modeling. But good question.
So how do you account for shifts in affiliation? So if I grew up Catholic, for example, and what I've found is that between 14 and 20, most people I know who grew up Catholic either shift way hard to the devout side or they go atheist agnostic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we actually have that was my master's thesis. We actually have a really cool indicator, and it's a proxy, but there's a question in there that says, what was your religious affiliation at age 16? And what is your religious affiliation today? So we can actually model whether or not you made a shift. And what's interesting is if you look at the overall changes, the Catholic Church is actually really held on to its percentages over time. So if you look at like when the survey started, the biggest group religiously in the United States was mainline Protestants. And that's like kind of your vanilla Protestants, like your Methodists and Lutherans and whatnot. So they have shrunk down to almost nothing. It's because they're leaving, they're becoming atheists, essentially. They're dropping out of the church. The biggest religious group today is no religion. Not a majority, but a plurality is no religion, slightly bigger than evangelicals. Catholics have held on. They're still the third largest group. And it's only because of immigration that they've been able to do that. Because Catholics, we know the Catholics who did not immigrate to the United States in general, they have fallen out. And exactly as you said, they just completely fell out of religion. And I was raised Catholic, and that's where I'm at too. It's so same story here. I'm a ex-Catholic anyway. But I can still do all the stuff. I know how to. Yeah, I know I can do all the things. And so it's interesting though, the Catholic Church is diversifying, and that presents a major problem for them, which is in places like in Los Angeles and Phoenix, where you have really large numbers of recent immigrant Catholics. They will do their morning services in English and then their mid-morning services in Spanish. And you almost have these churches that are divided culturally. And, if you look at Anglo-Catholics, white Catholics, they tend to be far more conservative than Catholics really anywhere else in the world. The Pope is very progressive. Latinx Catholics are very progressive in a lot, especially in economic kinds of issues. So when you talk about even within these groups, like if you were just to say, well, how tolerant are Catholics? That is a hard question to answer because they're such a divided group and they have such unique ways of thinking. Not only that, young Catholics and boomer Catholics and, silent generation Catholics are very different. So when we put our models together, we have to be very careful to make sure that we put in as many controls as we can to make sure that we're not, using these overarching kinds of concepts that serve as proxies for others that tend to be important. It's good. That's a really good point.
Christopher, did you get some sense of like how change occurs? I know you said that you were talking about, you said I'm just reporting the numbers here, but like through that, did you get some sense of like if I can think of a couple of examples. One is capital punishment in the United States. At times it's been more popular than others. And that's not because I don't think it's because people all of a sudden are starting to be born one way or the other. I think there's influence going on. And so basically like the types of intervention, you can also look at like whenever Obama was president, he talked about gay marriage and he said, at one point in time, he said, well, I think there should just be civil unions, and he wasn't necessarily on board with the marriages. And then I think what may have happened was like Gavin Newsom in San Francisco, he allowed it and then it caught on. And it seems like there's these interventions and, it adds to like the discord and then it brings about change. Did you get any sense of like what these mechanisms are and what works and what doesn't maybe?
Yeah. So that's a really great point. It can happen at both the cohort and the period level, but what you're saying is true. The period level matters. So like civil rights movement is a really good example of that. And so if we had to pinpoint it to one intervention, just to use that term, I like that term. That is when the civil rights movement was televised on the United States, and middle class Americans saw what was happening in the South. And they saw, what was happening with, the treatment of African Americans, and they knew abstractly what was going on. It was seeing it, the actually being able to see it happen, see the dogs, see the fire hoses that really got to people. And that had a dramatic impact. Within gays and lesbians, I think it is the movement, just like you said, the movement of leaders who started the out movement. And, at first you've got people who are resistant. Oh, look at all these people who are, want to talk about their sexuality openly. That's horrible. Until then all of a sudden your niece comes home for Thanksgiving and lets everybody know that she's gay. Right. And so then it hits home. And I think that's what's changing people's minds. If you look at people under the age of 25 right now, there is no difference in political affiliation for support for gays and lesbians. Republicans under 25, Democrats under 25, the exact same. That is so different than if you were to look at people in their 50s and 60s today. So it really depends when you're growing up and what you're seeing. I am so fascinated in COVID, and this is why I had a student just this last year take on this really excellent research methods project. She wanted to know what happened between 2000 and 2002. In other words, what happened because of 9/11. So she was using 9/11 as a demarcator. And she found some really interesting things. And the first is that social trust went way down in general. We trusted each other less. Strangely enough, we trusted the government more. And that may have had to do with military response, patriotism, we don't know. But what I thought was most fascinating is there's a question in there: do you find life exciting? People like the life excitement scores doubled after 9/11. People found their lives very exciting, but their happiness levels declined, which shows that excitement doesn't necessarily mean a positive thing. I want to know what happens after 2020. I want to see the data from 2018 versus the data from 2022, because I think we're going to see that it's not going to be a gap. It's going to be a chasm where we're going to see, I think life is going to be very exciting during this time, which is true. It's very exciting, but also not very happy because of all these other things that are going on. And so I think 2020 is going to be this great, like we're going to have so much data when this data finally comes out of what happened during these very pivotal years. I often wonder if like this is the year where we start to see public health in a really different way. And yes, we see these interesting, like you were talking about wind turbines, like why is that political? You know, why are wearing masks political? Why is social distancing political? These kinds of things. It will be really interesting to see if these shifts, large scale shifts, are actually a result of these intervention points, which could be, you know, thoughtful interventions. Let's try to change society, you know, intentionally versus a virus, which is kind of an accidental sort of thing that just happens environmentally, naturally. I think both of those have consequences. But yeah, I think you can look at those little demarcators in that timeline and be able to see where those interventions definitely have an impact.
Interesting, yeah. And just another thing that while you were talking that kind of come to mind is, you know, we talk about like interventions and how they, you know, promote change. I'd also be interested because you can, you know, take a group of people and have them exposed to the same, you know, I guess stimulus, you know, that would presumably cause change. And with some, it'll cause more change or less or none at all. And I think that's probably interesting too.
Yeah, and being able to isolate, economists do that all the time. Hey, Kevin. Economists tend to look, good to have you. Economists like to look at these naturally occurring accidents, and they're able to say, aha, here is, because the problem with the social sciences is you can't run experiments, right? If I want to know if poverty impacts your emotion, to do an experiment, I would have to assign kids at birth to be raised poor and other kids to be raised rich. So there's an ethical problem. We can't do experiments. That's why we have to do survey data. Behavioral economists have gotten around that issue by using natural historical occurrences as laboratories, as these interventions, kind of the way that you're talking about it, to see what happened. And so like they love using state policies. Like there was a state that, you know, if a state uses universal basic income, ooh, let's look at that state versus everyone else. That's a thing that happened. Or one state has an earthquake, another state doesn't. Let's see if that impacted human behavior. So those are just like great little accidents that we have, you know, that we have to wait to happen to see if we can discern some kind of difference to explain some kind of that variance.
Very, very interesting.
All right. Do we have any other questions from anyone? Okay. I kind of had one more question that I wanted to ask, which was, you said that the boomers actually were surprisingly liberal for their age group. Was that true also of millennials and Gen Z people? Do you know?
Yes. So this is kind of a tough one to talk about. When I say they're more liberal for their age. So
Right.
it's so hard to talk about. So, and that's where you have to disentangle the variance between age effects and cohort effects. So within boomers, the younger boomers tend to be more liberal than the older boomers, and the same is true for millennials. But if you look at what we would expect based off of a linear progression, based off of changes in age, using the whole data set, you see this weird thing happening where you would expect boomers to be much more conservative than they are. And what's happening is that there's this actual blip in the road where my generation, the Gen Xers, are the conservative ones. And so you've got silent, like if we were to get more more liberal as you go along. So silent generation, and then eventually you get to the boomers that become really liberal, and then the Gen Xers kind of bring it down, and then the millennials pick it back up again. And so it's actually my generation that sees the stall out in progressive ideas that happened. And then millennials kind of pick it back up again. But the one issue that the boomers are so unique on, and this gets back, I think, to John's question, I think this isn't, if you want to think about an intervention, Roe v. Wade. if you were alive to experience Roe v. Wade and that fight that was going on, that matters to you in a different way. I don't remember it, right? Millennials and Zoomers don't remember it. So they may have attitudes on abortion, but they're not as informed by what was going on at the time. Boomers are, strangely enough, about as liberal on abortion as the newer generations being born today, because of what was happening at that time. They're also incredibly likely to be pacifists because of the Vietnam War. So, and that just shows that it's not a straight line when it comes to tolerance in these issues, or, liberal or conservative views, because of these interventions that happen that kind of, they're almost like shocks, they kind of shock the system and change the order of things. You get to the Reagan years and there's more excitement in evangelicalism and religious conservatism, and that kind of changes that. There's major anti-abortion attitudes that come out in the 80s that sort of change that trajectory. So it's interesting when you look at it. So boomers are especially open-minded given their age. So that's the best way I can say it.
So I have a follow-up question on that, Christopher. Whenever you say like a group is like you talk about baby boomers being very liberal or liberal, is that a measure of both quantity and intensity? In other words, like how liberal they are and how many? Or is it just generally like if you check these boxes, you're liberal and there's that many? Or is it a combination of all of those things? Does that make sense, my question?
Yeah. Well, because boomers make up a large percentage of the population, right? And so, part of it has to do with qualitatively, like the answers that they give on these surveys. Yeah, that's part of it. What's interesting is you also have to look at, if you look at social change, you have to look at the demographic makeup of what the country looks like, because and that matters a lot. The boomers matter. So crime, I mentioned earlier that crime has been decreasing and everybody's been trying to figure out why. And so, like, for a long time, like, Clinton wanted to take credit for it. Oh, it was my what? No, probably not. It's because we had more police. It's because we had less police. It's because we incarcerated so many people, and so everyone's trying to take credit in these different forms as to why crime decreased. There, some famous economists even came up with the idea that it was Roe v. Wade, that it was abortion. So if you look at 1973 Roe v. Wade, 18 years after, those kids weren't around to be born, so they didn't commit crime. So it was actually the reason why crime went down is the people that would have been committing those crimes, that it was abortion that made up for that. Those would have been the people that would have been the most likely to have committed the crime. That was a very controversial paper. It turns out that the real reason, as far as we can tell, for why crime has decreased, and this is the most uninteresting answer ever, is because fewer young people are being born relative to the population as in the 1960s and 1970s. So think about when the baby boomers were that magic age of 18 to 25, where people commit crime. That was the heyday, in the 80s of high crime rates. And that persisted to the early 90s. And then in like 1991, all of a sudden crime just takes a nosedive. And that is basically when the boomers start to age out of their crime age. Right. And we start to get to these younger generations, and there's fewer of them. There are fewer younger people than there are older people. So if there are more older people in the generation, the things that older people do are going to become the norm, which is not committing crime. And so that means there are still young people committing crime, but in terms of relative proportion, just far fewer of them. So crime rates are what we think a statistical accident or artifact of the demographic makeup of the society. So when it comes to measuring the baby boomers, we're very careful to account for relative effect size of that cohort relative to others, because they're so big, they carry the weight for the rest of the country and a lot of types of issues. And they can make the country seem more liberal on things and more conservative on things, just because there's so many more of them relative to, for example, the Zoomers.
So interesting. This reminds me a little bit of like whenever you're troubleshooting. I'm a mechanical engineer, so I think of everything like a mechanical system maybe. But whenever you have like something that goes wrong, or maybe just something that happens in there, you try to say, well, what was it that happened? And so you have one of the things you were talking about with all these things that were going on, like what makes, why the crime stopped. I mean, it seems like there could be more than one thing. And what we would say is that's a nonlinear system. Like we can't necessarily pick it out and say it's this one thing that happened. was this, and then this happened, and basically this combination of things led to that. It just seems like in terms of problem solving and looking, at the dynamics of how something got to where they are now, that there's some parallels there,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And disentangling that stuff is really hard,
Yeah.
because sometimes we find these effects that are such heavy drivers, and it just turns out like age drives that crime effect so heavily, but so does sex, right? So men commit way more crime than women do. And so I mentioned I was raised in the Bakken in Williston, North Dakota. Well, during oil booms, men outnumber women 9-1. So guess what happens to those towns, right? Or incoming influx of new people, 9-1 male. So guess what happens to that neighborhood, that community, right? The crime just goes through the roof. Well, is it because things are going to heck? Kind of, yeah, but why? It's because young men are moving in, they commit all the crime. And so follow them around, and that's where you're going to follow, you're going to see those types of things. But you're right, we have to model all those things together, because it's not just that, it's also, it's like just anytime there's a change in society, like when I think about like those points of intervention, anytime we see a major change in society, like that's where we have to look for things. Emil Durkheim, as a sociologist, he called this anomie, and anomie is where we don't know what the norms are anymore. And that's definitely what's going on right now. When we forget the rules of society and we don't know how to react and respond, like what do we do to the virus? We don't know what to do right now. We have this national freak out, or this collective freak out. And that in and of itself is a variable that is so hard to measure. And it's part of that unexplained variance. And you have to like try to figure out, what is it? Like, what is that? But what's interesting is we're all experiencing it together. So you almost can't measure it at an individual level, because it's contextual. And we're all experiencing this shock to the system together. Like we're Zooming right now, like we're Zooming for everything right now. That is a shock to the system. And so like trying to figure out like why any of these large scale changes happen generally require us to be able to contextualize. What I like about HAPC modeling is hopefully we're able to figure that out. If I could figure out how to model anomie as a level 2, that would be like, that'd make my career, but I don't know how. So anyway, these things all kind of work together. And it's like, what I do like about this method is to kind of get to what you were talking, or get at what you were talking about. It does allow us to disentangle these things that tend to be so tightly correlated with one another. And it's kind of like this geeky science thing where we're trying to like, outdo the last thing that we did. But I think if it's for a good reason, which is if we need to make social policy that improves people's lives, that can make the environment better, that can save the economy, that can do these things, and then it's a worthwhile venture. Mm-hmm. Like I'm really not into the academic stuff where we're just trying to figure out interesting things. And there's a place for that. But I think like, especially at these times, like there are real problems that require real solutions. And that means that we got to get kind of creative and all hands on deck and figure this stuff out. So I am hopeful for new kinds of methodologies that allow us to get at these kind of nuances, because they matter when it comes time to actually institute policies that will have major impacts on people's lives.
Great. You went right where I was thinking whenever you said the thing about climate change. That's perhaps a lot of my motivation for, my interest in this is we got all this, work that we need to do, and we can't even get past the first stage, which is, getting people to embrace this idea that we've got this work to do. So
is it real? Right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. First step. Yeah. So it's very interesting stuff. Thanks for answering all my questions. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I'll open it up if anybody has any other comments or questions. Okay. So thanks for inviting me today. It's a blast. I've gotten a lot of mileage out of this last publication. This is about the 5th one that I've done. So I know this one, you guys got the polished version. And it's just been exciting doing this work. I'm excited to see what we come out with. We're going to, start branching out in other kinds of directions. And if you are, I'll leave you with these 2 last things. If you're in research and this is something that interests you, again, the PowerPoint slides are there. The formula's there if you want to try to model it yourself. You can get a hold of me if you have any questions about it. And, even if you're not going to do any kind of research in this field or anything that's kind of in the stratosphere, I will say that getting back to what I said at the beginning, having good relationships with advisors while you're in graduate school, getting to know people who take an interest in, the kinds of work that you want to do, those end up in really valuable reciprocal relationships later on. So value your time as a grad student. I miss it. It was such a great time. I wouldn't go back. I don't want to do my comps again. I don't want to write another dissertation. But this is really kind of a special time for those of you who are in the thick of it.
Okay, well, I guess if nobody has any further questions, thank you all for coming today. And
Christopher, I will be reaching out to you for dialogue and discussion. We
Absolutely.
have a project going on in India, and both Haley and John sort of touched upon it. And I want to see if the sorts of things that you have are usable in the Indian context.
Absolutely.
In particular, let me tell you what I'm interested in. How do you define the quality of life? It's very similar to the problem that you're dealing with. You're saying, how do you define your values? Whether they come from Christianity, whether they come from Catholicism or what have you. You're asking people what their current values are. And I'm interested in knowing how people have, what their current values are in terms of economic development and what they would like to do in the future.
Let's have that conversation, because I actually know of a global, it's called the World Value Survey. And it's surveyed every few years. And I think we might be able to put some ideas together. Yep.
And associated with that is we have put in a proposal for a big idea challenge. And the notion of getting values is extremely important, because that's what drives human beings. So I'm not interested in how values change. I'm interested in knowing what their values are, etc.
Very
Okay.
cool.
So maybe John would like to join us. Haley would like to join us in this discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Send you've got my email address.
Yeah.
Go ahead and coordinate it and send it to me, and let's work it out. I got 2 months off for Christmas break, so sounds great.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
Bye, folks. If anybody would like to stick around to continue the conversation, I will certainly keep the thing